Hey, before we get into this story, I want to ask you something real quick. Where are you watching this from right now? Your city? Your country? Drop it in the comments below. I genuinely read every single one. Every single one. And it means more than you know. And actually, one more thing.
What time is it where we are right now?
Just curious. Are you watching this in the morning with your coffee? Late at night when everyone else is asleep? Tell me. Drop it down there. Today's like goal is just 10. That's it. 10 likes. If you think this story deserves it, that's all I'm asking. 10. And if you're new here and you like history that actually happened, history that nobody talks about, hit subscribe. We go deep on this channel, very deep. All right, now, let me take you somewhere. It is November 1965. The jungle has no name on any map that matters. It is 600 hours, central highlands of South Vietnam. The kind of heat that sits on your chest before the sun has even fully risen. Triple canopy forest. No light reaches the ground. The men of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment have been walking since before dawn. Single file, machetes forward, boots sinking into red mud with every step. And then, the jungle goes quiet. Not gradually, not slowly, all at once. Every bird, every insect, every living thing in that forest stops. Private First Class Toby Braveboy, 20 years old, from Coward, South Carolina, raises his fist. The column freezes. Nobody speaks. Nobody breathes. And for exactly 10 minutes, nothing happens. Then the world explodes. So here is the question that has stayed with veterans, historians, and researchers for 60 years. Did the jungle know what was coming before the men? To understand what those men experienced, you need to understand where they were and what they were walking into. The year is 1965. The Vietnam War has just entered a brutal new phase. On November 14th of that year, the United States Army committed its first major ground forces to a full-scale battle against North Vietnamese regulars. The location was the Ia Drang Valley, deep in the central highlands of South Vietnam, 37 miles west of Pleiku, near the Cambodian border. The unit was the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, America's most technologically advanced infantry force, transported by Huey helicopters, supported by artillery and B-52 bombers. These were not inexperienced men. And yet, the North Vietnamese Army's 66th Regiment had been in that jungle for weeks. They knew every trail, every shadow, every silence. According to after-action reports filed with the U.S. Army Center of Military History and documented in historian Harold Moore's account, we were soldiers once, and young. The North Vietnamese had positioned themselves so close to American columns that, in some cases, men were separated by less than 30 feet of undergrowth without knowing it. The terrain of the Central Highlands is not like anything most Americans had ever trained for. Triple canopy jungle. Visibility sometimes measured in feet, not yards. Humidity above 90%. Temperature pushing over 100 degrees. Point men had to rotate every 10 to 15 minutes just from the physical exhaustion of cutting trail with a machete. These were trained soldiers. Veterans of drill, of discipline, of previous skirmishes. Men who knew the difference between a branch snapping from wind and a branch snapping from weight. And almost every single one of them, in letters, diaries, and recorded testimonies collected by the Army Heritage Center Foundation, mentioned the same thing, the silence. But it was not the enemy that these soldiers feared most in those moments. It was the quiet that came before them. Private First Class Toby Braveboy, 20 years old, from Coward, South Carolina. That is a real town. Population under 300. Flat farmland, red dirt roads, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody and nobody locks their doors. He had been in Vietnam for 9 weeks when the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry moved out from Landing Zone X-Ray toward Landing Zone Albany on the morning of November 17, 1965. In the post-war testimony collection held by the Army Heritage Center Foundation and cross-referenced in multiple regimental histories of the 1st Cavalry Division, Braveboy's account is one of the most specific and most cited. He later described it like this. He said the jungle in the central Highlands was never truly quiet. Not in the way people picture silence. There were always insects. There was always birdsong at dawn. There was always something moving somewhere above you in the canopy. After 9 weeks, a man learned what normal sounded like. He learned it the way you learn a new language, without thinking about it, just absorption. On the morning of November 17th, the column had been moving for roughly 2 hours. Braveboy was not on point. He was maybe 8 men back from the front of the column. The light was low, the canopy thick. He could not see more than 10 feet in any direction, and then the birds stopped. Not one bird, not a few, all of them. He said in his recorded testimony, and I want to be careful to represent this accurately, that the silence was not just the absence of sound. It felt like pressure, like the air itself had changed, like something very large was holding its breath very close to him. He raised his fist, the hand signal for halt. The column stopped. For 10 minutes, nothing moved. Nobody spoke. Men stood absolutely still in the red mud, rifles up, breathing through their noses. And then one of the men near the front of the column shifted his weight. Just his weight. One boot adjusting in the mud, and the jungle opened fire from every direction simultaneously. The North Vietnamese Army's 66th Regiment had been lying in concealed positions alongside the American column, in some cases no more than 20 feet away, waiting for movement, waiting for noise, waiting for exactly that moment. Braveboy survived. Many of the men around him did not. But here is what he said afterward, in the testimony that researchers have returned to again and again. He said, "The jungle knew. The jungle knew 10 minutes before we did. Hold on, I need to stop you right here. What do you think happened? Was it pure biology, animals sensing human movement, chemical signals, vibration? Was it something the soldiers were trained to feel and then projected onto the environment? Or is there something about this jungle, this specific terrain, that nobody has fully explained yet? Drop it in the comments. I want to see where you land, because the records say something very specific. Let's look at what they actually show. It is 0930 hours, November 17th, 1965. The column is strung out over several hundred meters of narrow jungle trail, 240 men. A long, thin line of American soldiers moving through dense elephant grass and triple canopy forest toward landing zone Albany. The heat is already vicious. Men have been awake since before 400. They have eaten cold sea rations. Their boots are soaked through. The point men are rotating every 10 minutes from the effort of cutting trail. Radio communication is intermittent. The canopy kills signal. At the head of the column, a command group stops to question 2 North Vietnamese soldiers who have been captured earlier that morning. The column halts in place. 240 men standing in the jungle, in a long stretched line, not moving. And that is the moment the jungle goes silent. Not just the birds this time. Everything. The insects stop. The ambient hum that never leaves tropical jungle, that constant biological background frequency, cuts out, like someone threw a switch. Multiple veterans in separate accounts describe the same sensation in those seconds. Sergeant Steve Hansen, 2nd Battalion, later told oral history researchers at the University of Kentucky that he felt the air pressure change. Not a physical change, but something in his body registered it. The same animal instinct that raises the hair on the back of your neck in a dark room. Except in this case, the dark room is an entire jungle. And the threat is 200 North Vietnamese soldiers lying motionless in the undergrowth on both sides of the trail, so close that, in some positions, American soldiers could have touched them without moving their feet. The NVA do not fire immediately. They wait. They have been waiting, some of them, since before dawn, lying on the jungle floor, not moving, barely breathing. The discipline required for that is almost incomprehensible. And then, at 0955 hours, a click. Survivors later described it as a series of clicking sounds. Then the entire jungle erupts. Automatic rifle fire from both sides, mortars, RPGs. The ambush is not aimed at the front of the column. It is aimed at the middle, the longest and most vulnerable point, splitting the unit in two, preventing coordination, preventing retreat, preventing anything except survival. Within the first 3 minutes, most of the officers in 2 companies are dead or wounded. The official after-action report, filed with the U.S. Army and available through the National Archives, records that companies C and D took the heaviest casualties. Of the men who went in that day, 155 Americans did not come back, the largest single-day loss of American life in the Vietnam War up to that point. And the jungle, witnesses said later, was completely silent for the 10 minutes before it began. Now, if this were one man's memory, one traumatized soldier's recollection of a day when everything went wrong, it would still be significant. But it would be one account, one data point. It is not one account. The phenomenon of jungle silence as a pre-ambush warning is documented across multiple units, multiple operations, and multiple years of the Vietnam War. And every account adds a detail that the others did not have. The first comes from Sergeant Robin Bartlett, 25th Infantry Division, who served in Vietnam from 1967 to 1968. In his memoir, Vietnam Combat, Firefights and Writing History, Bartlett describes patrol operations in what soldiers called wait-a-minute jungle, named for the thorned vines that grabbed your equipment and slowed every step. He writes that experienced point men in his unit developed what they called a roule. If you cannot hear insects, you stop walking. Not maybe, you stop. Because in 3 years of patrol operations, every time the insects went quiet and a patrol kept moving, they found the enemy the hard way. The second account comes from a different theater of operations entirely. Captain Keith Nightingale, writing about his experiences in War Zone D on June 27, 1967, published a detailed account on Sherry's Writer, a Vietnam veteran documentation project. He describes a night patrol where the jungle, in his words, was hitherto silent, and then describes the precise moment the ambient biological noise of the jungle returned as the patrol settled. The implication in his account is clear. While his men were stationary and quiet, the jungle was also quiet, because something else was moving nearby. The third account is from a different type of source entirely. A wartime letter preserved in the collections of the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, written in late 1966 by a soldier whose name has been partially redacted in the public record, describes a patrol near the A Shau Valley. He writes to his family that the older soldiers in his unit had told him one rule above all others on patrol. He writes, and this is documented text from that letter, "They say if the jungle gets quiet and stays quiet, you stop and you wait. You don't keep moving. You wait until it talks again." He adds that he did not understand this when he arrived. He says he understood it completely by the end of his first month. The fourth account is the most unexpected. It comes not from an American soldier, but from a South Vietnamese Army officer, Captain Nguyen Van Heap, whose post-war testimony was recorded as part of an oral history project conducted by Texas Tech University's Vietnam Center and Archive one of the largest collections of Vietnam War primary sources in the world. Heap had fought in the Central Highlands for 3 years before the arrival of American forces. He states in his recorded testimony that Vietnamese soldiers and local farmers in the region had a name for the silence. He does not translate it directly, but describes it as meaning, roughly, the jungle holds its breath. He says this was not superstition, it was operational knowledge. It had been passed down through the French colonial war before Vietnam, through the resistance against Japanese occupation during World War II, and before that, through generations of people living and hunting in that specific terrain. The silence was not new in 1965. It had a name before the Americans arrived. Stay with me, because the final account in this story, the one that took decades to surface, is unlike anything I have shown you yet. If you have made it this far, genuinely, thank you. Hit that like button right now if this story has you thinking. It costs you nothing, and it means everything for this channel. Now let's go all the way to the top. So what actually happened? Why did the jungle go silent? There are 4 serious explanations that researchers, veterans, and ecologists have proposed over the past 60 years. None of them fully close the question. This is the most straightforwardly scientific explanation, and it is well supported. Tropical wildlife, particularly birds and insects, are extremely sensitive to vibration, movement, chemical signals, and changes in barometric pressure. When a large mass of human beings carrying metal equipment, moving through undergrowth, approaches a forest zone, animals can detect that approach long before any human would. Birds fall silent. Insects stop. The biological alarm system of the jungle activates in a cascade from species to species. This is documented in ecological literature and is consistent with what veterans described. What it cannot explain. Why did the silence occur when the North Vietnamese soldiers, who had been stationary and silent for hours, were already in position? If the wildlife was responding to movement, the movement had stopped. The NVA were lying still. The Americans had halted. And yet, in multiple accounts, the silence deepened in those final minutes. Not when movement was occurring, but when both sides were motionless. Military psychologists and historians, including those who contributed to the U.S. Army's own after-action review processes following Vietnam, have documented extensively how combat experience sharpens peripheral awareness to an almost unconscious level. A soldier who has survived multiple patrols may be detecting microsignals, sounds, smells, visual disturbances so small they cannot consciously identify them, but their nervous system registers the threat before their conscious mind does. The jungle going quiet, maybe, in this interpretation, the soldier's own heightened alertness being felt as external rather than internal. What it cannot explain. Multiple soldiers in the same column, at different positions, who could not see or hear each other, described the same sensation at the same time. Braveboy was 8 men from the front. Hansen was near the rear. They did not compare notes in the moment. They compared notes decades later and found they had experienced the same thing simultaneously. There is a practical military possibility that deserves serious consideration. The NVA were extraordinarily disciplined fighters. They were trained to suppress all ambient noise in their own positions, to move only when absolutely necessary, and to create a kind of enforced stillness around their ambush sites. It is possible that the wildlife reacted not to the approaching Americans, but to the unusual discipline of the NVA themselves. 200 soldiers lying absolutely motionless in a jungle would create an unnatural zone of stillness that wildlife would register and avoid. The silence would be the NVA's own presence, not a warning system, but a signature. What it cannot explain. why the silence lifted gradually after the ambush began, with animal sounds returning to sectors away from the fighting before they returned to the kill zone. If the silence was simply the NVA's presence, it should have ended the moment the firing started and movement resumed. The pattern of sound returning in waves suggests something else was involved. Captain Heap's testimony points towards something that researchers have found difficult to classify. The central highlands of Vietnam were inhabited, long before any war, by indigenous montagnard peoples who had lived in and moved through that jungle for centuries. Their oral traditions, collected by French ethnographers in the early 20th century and now partially archived through Vietnamese academic institutions, contain specific references to the jungle's breath as a navigational and survival signal. They describe it not as supernatural but as ecological. The jungle, in their framework, communicates. It has done so for as long as their people have lived inside it. The war did not create that silence. The war walked into it. None of these explanations fully accounts for what multiple trained soldiers, men who had faced enemy fire and had no reason to invent stories, said they experienced in those 10 minutes. There is one more account. It comes from Lieutenant General Harold G. Moore. If you know the Battle of Ia Drang, you know that name. He was a lieutenant colonel in November 1965, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, one of the units that fought in the initial engagement at Landing Zone X-Ray. He survived the battle. He spent years afterward documenting it with journalist Joseph Galloway. Their book, We Were Soldiers Once, and Young, published in 1992, and based on years of interviews with survivors and access to declassified military records, is now considered one of the definitive primary source accounts of that battle and its aftermath. In that account, and in subsequent interviews Moore gave to military historians, he returns more than once to the question of what the jungle communicated to experienced soldiers. He describes something that he frames carefully, the way a man frames something he cannot explain through the vocabulary he was trained to use. He says that his most effective veterans, the men who had been in country longest, developed an ability to read the jungle's noise as an intelligence source, not metaphorically. Operationally, they used it the way other units used radio intercepts. They used it to make decisions. He describes one patrol, not the Albany ambush, but an earlier one, where a sergeant stopped his column based solely on the silence, held his men in place for over 20 minutes, and then signaled a withdrawal. No contact was made, no shots were fired. When the area was examined by a different unit 3 days later, they found a prepared NVA ambush position, firing lanes cut through the undergrowth, concealed fighting positions, food wrappers that were still relatively fresh. The sergeant's column had stopped at the outer edge of the kill zone. The jungle had told him. He had listened. Moore noted, and this is the detail that stays with you, that when he asked the sergeant afterward how he had known, the man was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I didn't know, sir. The jungle knew. I just paid attention." Moore never filed that account as an official recommendation. He never wrote a doctrine around it. He included it in the book, in the oral record, and then left it exactly where it belongs, in the space between what we can explain and what we cannot. Here is what I keep coming back to. We talk about the Vietnam War in terms of strategy, politics, body counts, tactical failures, and political miscalculations. We talk about the technology gap, the helicopter revolution, the tunnel systems, the unconventional enemy. We almost never talk about what the jungle itself was doing. The men who fought in the Central Highlands, the ones who came home and lived long enough to give recorded testimony, consistently describe an environment that was not neutral. not passive. They describe a jungle that responded, that warned, that communicated in a frequency that required a particular kind of listening. Not training, something older. The question that stays with me is this. If trained soldiers with modern equipment, scientific frameworks, and no particular inclination toward mysticism, independently and repeatedly describe the same phenomenon across years of separate operations, what does that tell us about the gap between what we can measure and what is actually present? Private Braveboy came home. He was one of the survivors. In a 1998 interview with a veteran documentation project in South Carolina, he was asked if he had ever gone back to Vietnam. He said no. He was asked why. He said, "Because the jungle remembers me too." Now I want to hear from you. Which of those 4 explanations feels closest to true? Or do you have a 5th one that I have not considered? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read every single one. Let's talk about it. We set a goal of 10 likes today. If we crossed it, that is your support pushing this channel forward. If we have not yet, this is your moment. Next time, we go to a different war, a different jungle, a different century, and an account from a British officer that was classified for 30 years before anyone was allowed to read it. Subscribe so you do not miss it. I will see you in the dark.